Welcome to the year-end edition of The Opinion Show, the weekly gathering with my colleagues on the editorial board of the Plain Dealer and the Northeast Ohio Media Group. I'm Chris Quinn, and I'm here today with Opinion Director Betsy Sullivan, editorial writers Chris Evans and Sharon Broussard, Deputy Editorial Page Editor Kevin O'Brien, and editorial writer Pete Krause. The Opinion Show is about adding perspective to big stories of the day, and the end of the year, we figure, is the best time to look back on the big stories of the year and see if the lens of time has changed our perspective. So we're going to tackle 6 of the bigger stories of this year. The first we're looking at is the Ebola story that hit us in October when the scare of Ebola moved from a continent far away into the United States in Texas and in Cleveland. Nurse Amber Vinson, who had treated a man dying of Ebola in Dallas, boarded a plane, flew to Cleveland to plan her wedding, then contracted a fever, called the CDC to ask if it was okay to fly, got permission, and flew back to Dallas, where she was diagnosed with Ebola. It led to a big scare in Ohio. In the end, nobody else contracted the disease, and we learned a lot. So I want to start there with what lessons we seem to have learned about our preparedness for big epidemics. Sharon, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think unfortunately one of the lessons we learned was that the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, was not quite prepared on how to handle this. In particular, it turns out that she had given them a call to ask for permission to fly, so to speak, and they did. Several days later, they scrambled about and backtracked on that, never quite explained why she got those directions. I think it led to, though, a better sense that this country, even though we're very powerful and we have all this medical technology at hand, that there's still some things that we needed to learn how to do better. And from that, fortunately, there's been more money for Ebola, SWAT teams, several hospitals have been designated Ebola centers, and so now we have that infrastructure which we didn't have before. So it had a happy ending, but it was a very scary, weekend or so.
Well, I would say it is actually, let's see what happens the next time, because one thing that was clear was that the hospital procedures weren't adequate for protecting the healthcare workers, and I do think that was the root of the issue with Nurse Vincent and with the second nurse who contracted Ebola, that the CDC was not expecting that to happen because they were taking precautions. But in fact, the precautions, the oversight, the training, the procedures were not adequate. So to me, that was the big lesson learned from that.
Right. Inevitably, we will be dealing with a dangerous epidemic in this country sometime in the future. This pretty much showed we weren't really ready, but we might have learned the lessons for that big epidemic.
The other interesting thing is that none of the healthcare workers that contracted Ebola, either those 2 nurses or the healthcare workers that did so in West Africa, died, with the one exception of the man who misdiagnosed himself and did die. And it does suggest that if the disease is caught early and adequate health care is given, that lives will be saved, that it's not quite as deadly as we might have anticipated.
Yeah. Kevin, I suspect that you don't think the U.S. response was the right response to this.
No, I never had any doubt that this wasn't going anywhere, and to me it never was that scary. I just think with the infrastructure, the medical infrastructure that we have, whatever, even if it got a little bit out of hand, which it never did, it was going to be arrested in plenty of time to keep it from being an epidemic that would get into the general population. If you were a healthcare worker, you were certainly at risk for just the reasons Betsy mentioned. We were not ready to deal with it at the hospital level, and it was luck of the draw where you wound up and whether they knew what to do or not. But as far as it becoming a mass infection situation, never going to happen.
Because this is a hard one to contract, but do you think this was instructive for when there's a more contagious illness that gets into our borders?
Yeah, and I think what Sharon said about the CDC is right also. That, they were not prepared. They did a horrible job with the public relations and information, which is supposed to be one of their strong suits. And so, I hope those lessons were learned, but this was not anything like the scary thing that a lot of people made it out to be.
Yeah, I agree. I thought the hysteria from the beginning was over the top because it is very hard to contract. However, I think it says a lot about how much information and how quickly you need to get information to people about different diseases that are lurking, so to tamp down on that fear.
Well, maybe worry less about the general public, which was not particularly at risk in this one, and concentrate on the professionals who are going to be dealing directly with it, which I think they said they were doing and they didn't.
Yeah, but I would argue that you have to do both because, you had people, schools closing and people not going to the wedding shop that she had been to, though,
Right.
There was like minuscule chance that anyone was going to get sick. So, and that kind of all fuels then, phone calls into already busy emergency hospitals and panic mode that you don't need to have when you have an epidemic.
Right.
Although I think it has to be pointed out that one of the best practices with Ebola is to identify everyone who has been exposed, no matter what their degree of exposure, and track them. And this is expensive and time-consuming, and the state of Ohio did this in a, I thought, very professional and comprehensive way. And none of those people, fortunately, contracted Ebola, but it is important to do that because that's the lesson of Ebola. You have to keep it contained.
Yes.
I think it also means that unless we want to shut off West Africa from the rest of the world, that we have to do more, the whole world has to do more to address the problem there and to see if it, to make sure that it doesn't, fester even more than it has.
Let's move on to another of the big stories of this year, the spectacular collapse of the governor's race when, after the revelations that Democratic challenger to John Kasich, Ed Fitzgerald, had been caught in a car in the middle of the night with a woman who was not his wife in a secluded parking lot, and two, even more surprising, that he had pretty much been driving for 10 years without a driver's license. It seems like the voters could never get beyond that driver's license issue, which was not explained. We're some months beyond that now. What are the lessons beyond that candidates need to have valid driver's licenses? What is the lesson, Kevin, do you think, for the Democratic Party?
Vet your candidates better, I suppose, would be at the top of the
Check the
list.
driver's license.
Yeah, exactly. Ask for ID.
Ask.
Yeah, ask for ID. If you're going to have somebody run for governor, make sure you get a look at their driver's license.
But this is also, the whole Democratic ticket lost. The party seems to be in a bit of a shambles. They're replacing their leadership even as we speak. This deprived Ohio of a debate about the state of things, something you count on every 4 years. Is there a prescription for repairing this damage? How do the Democrats rise from this?
Well, this is the same shape the Republicans were in not all that long ago in Ohio. They were decimated, and nobody was voting for them. Nobody cared anymore. The party was dead, and the Democrats were counting legislatures into infinity that they would run, or governorships at least, and none of that turned out to be true. It's also changeable and also cyclical in politics. Parties are up and they're down, and it's the nature of the beast. It's always going to. You're never going to have a perfectly stable, eternal situation for any political party.
One little
Can't
recession and it all changes.
Exactly.
But I also think leadership of the party matters, especially at the state level. Tom Sotos has written about this extensively in his columns, and he's the walking encyclopedia of Ohio history, political history especially, and he has documented how the Republicans rebuilt sort of one race at a time and really went after grassroots and comprehensively, and they're still reaping the benefits of that. Yeah. Whereas the Democrats have had this kind of mercurial leadership. I think now is an opportunity to change that with Chris Redford not only being tossed on his ear by the party, but by the voters in his district as well, a time to reassess whether the Democrats are going to be that kind of patient rebuilding party or not.
So they went and they got a likable guy who holds. Oh wait, no, that's not right.
No, yeah,
David Pepper is the answer? I don't know.
Pepper. Yeah, I'm worried about Pepper. I don't know.
So Pepper
Need to
ran
check
a
his blood
very,
pressure.
shall we say, spicy campaign.
Yeah.
But he is, in fact, an elected official from a Republican-leaning part of the state. So he has shown himself to be somebody who can cross, the aisles when he sort of hangs his partisanship up on the hook. It's possible.
Hard
he's
for a
smart
party leader to do.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
that's
well.
true. That's true. But nonetheless, maybe somebody who will be a little bit more careful and a little bit less corrosive, if you will, which is a word I would use about Redfern.
Yeah, and I heard David Pepper and Nina Turner on Idea Stream this morning talking about building the party up from the ground up and making sure that people are then, talking to their neighbors about things, and that the lower level people aren't left out that are in the party. And, what you saw, I thought it really exposed the weakness of the party, that no one could tell Fitzgerald, for example, that, please get out, by deadline time, and maybe try to get Strickland or someone in.
To do that.
Yeah.
Well, on the other side of the aisle, the Republicans gave Cleveland one of the biggest pieces of good news they've ever had with the awarding of the Republican National Convention in 2016. Something that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago has buoyed the city. What does that mean for the city long-term, do you think, Betsy?
I mean, I think it's been 100% positive so far. What we've seen is a lot more focus on these sort of undone projects, getting them done, getting the city a full facelift by the time the Republicans come. The Fodor just named, Cleveland one of the 25 must-visit places in the world for, this year, or next year, I should say, and Travel and Leisure magazine had already put it on their top 50. Trendy, chic, in vogue, urban living, good food. I don't know that we would necessarily be getting that attention if it weren't for the fact that the Republicans had sort of said the same thing when they decided to come.
Right, but the other good thing is, if you drive down Martin Luther King Drive now, it's beautiful. Road repairs, are going on all over the city. Roads that look like they were out of Afghanistan are now freshly paved, beautiful roads.
Pete, do you think the city officials and the greater business community can pat themselves on the back? They've been quietly working since the 10 years ago to rebuild the city and get a lot of public projects under works. Do you think that has a lot to do with this election?
Their input? Yeah, I think how can you not give them credit? They had to raise the money. I think it's like $50 million to show the Republicans that they were serious. They did that with some help from the state. They're pushing through these projects, like Betsy said, the pedestrian bridge, the hotel down there next to the convention center should be ready. The public square changeover. They're pushing these things hard. Some people may get run over a little bit.
But I guess what I'm getting at is this the return on a long investment? People have had their kind of noses to the grindstone trying to get things happening in Cleveland, and it's happened incrementally. Is this kind of the end of that road where you sit down and say, wow, look what's happened in this city?
Well, I'll be honest, I've always wondered, especially, going back over the last 10 years, we were in a bit of a drought there. It seemed like, downtown had turned into a bit of a wasteland, and I was beginning to wonder, where was the leadership? They must have been working behind the scenes quietly to do some of these things, and you certainly have to give them credit. They've produced.
I think it's made a big difference that the Governor Kasich has been very engaged in, Northern Ohio, Northeast Ohio, and Cleveland. I think he correctly read, one of the undoings of his predecessor was that being from Southern Ohio, he ignored the Northern Ohio's interests, and Kasich has delivered on the money for Opportunity Corridor. He and the mayor formed this partnership on the school funding issue, and I think that's had enduring benefits for the city. And clearly, the Republicans could sense that there was, kind of a symbiotic relationship there between the Democrat who runs Cleveland and the Republican who runs Ohio.
Yeah, I think Frank Jackson is the governor's favorite mayor. He always, likes to stop in. But, just going back to what we talked about previously and the politics, the fact that Kasich has done a lot of these things, and he did marginalize Fitzgerald to a large degree, had a lot to do with him succeeding.
But, the Republicans also picked Cleveland not just because it's a great place. There's a strategy at work, right? They're...
Certainly.
And we could learn in the new year that the Democrats pick up on that strategy and go to Columbus.
That would be
At least
cool.
it's not the
Yeah.
Olympics.
Yeah.
Apart from Ebola, we did have a bona fide public health crisis this year. For 3 days, the residents of Toledo were unable to drink their water because of algal blooms that had put poison into it. This seems like it should have been considered an all-stops crisis. But here we are months later, nothing's changed. So the likelihood, Chris, is next year we'll be dealing
Well,
with it
hopefully,
again.
you know, I mean, the Speaker of the House picked Dave Hall to get through this mid-biennium agricultural bill that would address this issue, which a lot of this phosphorus that's running into the Western Basin is coming from agriculture, because farmers have this practice where they put fertilizer and manure on frozen ground. And so come the spring and the rains, all that washes into the basin. And Hall, instead of really focusing on that issue, kind of opened this bill up it just became a toxic dump of.
Well, I think you would have to be fair to him that provision was already in the mid-biennium bill, and it was completed and ready to go, and he opened it up so that there could be additional reforms, and what happened was then he lost control of that process. Which we have been critical of him for doing,
right.
but yeah.
But I think even what he had in the bill could have been made stronger. I mean, they didn't make anything mandatory, and I think that's what they need to do.
But, think about it. If the residents of New York City or Philadelphia or one of the big cities in America got up one morning and learned they couldn't drink their water because of this kind of a crisis, don't you think there'd be a more crisis-oriented reaction from the federal government, the state government,
Absolutely.
local officials?
Well, the governor is going to have to probably step in here and take action. If there ever was an example of a governor or a chief executive taking executive action, it would be to fend off a potential public health crisis, which this is.
This was a massive environmental disaster. Nearly 500,000 people without drinking water for 3 days.
And nothing's changed.
And nothing's changed.
Although part of it turns out to be that the Toledo water treatment plant didn't have adequate technology or testing gear, and maybe there wasn't, as big of a crisis as we thought. One of the things that struck me was all the fingers pointing like that. So instead of somebody stepping forth and taking charge and sort of getting to the bottom of things, we found when the EPA, ODNR, and the Department of Agriculture officials came up to brief us that they don't have sufficient money even to figure out what the source of the problem is. So, that kind of handicaps you in designing a solution.
Well, I think they know what the source of the problem is. They don't know where, how to strategically address it. So they need money to figure out, put monitors down, find out where most of this stuff is coming from, and then treat it. And they've made these commitments, but they're 1, 2, 3 year commitments down the road. And we're going into winter, obviously. There is nothing in place, so unless the legislature does something immediately in January and puts in an emergency clause to make it effective immediately, farmers will once again be putting manure and chemical fertilizer on frozen ground, and this spring we will again have massive algal blooms.
Though again, we do not know to what extent farmers do that, because obviously it's not cost effective to put fertilizer down that gets washed off immediately and doesn't go into the ground. So, again, I think that the experts here have most of them feel that we don't really have the full picture. And in fact, that state agencies contend that a lot of this might have to do with these aging septic systems in that part of Ohio, because that was used to be the black swamp. I mean, that soil is really porous. It's one reason why the Maumee River gets so clogged up and the dredge gets dumped in Lake Erie by the Army Corps, which we haven't even mentioned, but that contributes to the loss of oxygen and the buildup of algal blooms there. So that's a big issue that the state, I think, has to take a much stronger stance about. But those septic systems too, those are that's extremely expensive to repair for an individual family, and that's hampered change, and changing agricultural practices can be expensive, because all those farmers have to go out and buy new equipment. So it's not easy, not something you can fix right overnight.
Another story that we don't have much of a lens of time on because it's fairly recent was the Department of Justice report on the use of excessive force by the Cleveland police. Pete, it's a little bit early to say we've learned a lot of lessons from this, especially since the city seems to be resisting some of the findings without being specific. What have we learned so far?
Well, I think what we learned is that our instincts were correct going back several years, that there was a problem within the Cleveland Police Department. The DOJ report, which began an investigation back in early 2013, extended over a year or so, determined that far too many police officers were engaging in techniques or tactics that caused them to ultimately use excessive force. And I think we've learned that it is a very serious, very prevalent problem within the police department, but I think it's also going to be one that is going to be difficult to turn around, because there is a certain amount of defensiveness, I think, within the Jackson administration on what exactly they're going to be asked to do by the DOJ.
But let's talk about that a little bit, because what the Jackson administration is saying is they want to investigate the findings of what's going on, that there's anecdotal information, but what does it mean? But ultimately, what the Justice Department's report advocates is best practices for policing, to investigate every time an officer pulls a gun, to make sure you have a system where people can complain. So if the city is being resisted, which of the best practices are they going to say they don't want to adopt?
I don't think they're going to say much at all. I mean, I think they're saying that they want to investigate what's in that report. I don't think there's going to be much investigation by the city. I think that's posturing. I think the mayor has to take a position that is somewhat defensive and protective of the police force, because you can't just totally embrace what's in the report.
Why not?
Because I think you will lose some of your support from your police force. You have to show them a certain amount of support going forward. He's got to walk a tightrope here to a certain extent.
Except I don't think that report was as critical of the force as of the management of the force,
Right.
as of the people calling the shots. I mean, one of my big takeaways is that we don't actually even know the extent of this problem because of the very poor and sort of see no evil system of accountability and reporting within the police
Well,
department.
that's part of the problem here. Is the report says that it's the leadership and the training and things like that. The leadership saying is, well, no, it's rogue police officers who don't know how to follow direction. Well, either way, there's a problem. I mean, if you're bringing people into your police force that can't do things the way they're supposed to be, then there's a problem there. So either way, there's a problem.
Yeah, but
there.
I think you want to make a bold statement with something like this. I mean, the death of a 12-year-old child is, I mean, that's a seminal moment. That can never happen again. And I think with the leadership in the police department, that's where you start.
Oh, I would agree. I think there has to be a change.
You can point fingers at rogue officers or not, and then you've got to work on training and policies and making sure that these police officers are well trained, know how to react in these situations, and we don't have incidents like this. I mean, under McGrath and Marty Flask, we've had Sowell, we've had East Cleveland, 137 bullets shot into a car with 2 unarmed suspects, and now Tamir Rice. I mean, this is totally unacceptable.
Agreed.
But isn't the debate over the replacing the leaders a bit of a distraction from the greater issue, which is that a lot of the systems that they have in place don't work, and they have to be retooled with the best practices? The debate has been sidetracked by this discussion on Marty Flask and Mike McGrath, and so nothing seems to be moving on the bigger issues.
Right.
Go ahead, Betsy.
I was going to let Sharon.
It's culture, I think.
Yeah.
And yes, I think I think you guys are making good points about the leadership and whether or not there should be a change. And, I would say yes, but honestly, you could put new people on top and you still have the same culture and the same practices and policies. It's not going to make a difference. And so that's what they have to tackle. I'm surprised that this mayor isn't like waving around that DOJ report and say, hey guys, I hate to do this to you, but they might come in here and they might, toss us all out, toss all you guys out. This way, you have a chance to remake your image and, do a better job policing and keep people safe and your community safe. So, I don't see why he's not grasping this opportunity and blaming
that's
the DOJ
the problem,
for it. So.
Is that the mayor is playing things very close to his vest, and I think why the focus on the leadership is important is because it suggests that he's going to do what Pete just talked about and say again, oh, the rogue officers are at work, as opposed to acknowledging systemic problems that have been perpetuated by those in charge.
Right, and I think when you bring in new leadership, you're not just bringing in fresh faces. I mean, you're bringing in people who understand best practices and know how to implement them. So, I mean, I think it's not just changing, it's not just musical chairs. It's-
Although the
They
history
they
of
also
the,
have to be able to sell that to the rank and file
That's right. This
people,
is
which is going to
Kevin's
be
point.
difficult to do because they see things their own way and best practices are what they do each day as far as they're concerned. But you've got to end up in a consent decree somehow. So there's going to be some agreement. Whether it's followed or not may be another question, but ultimately the city, to get out from under this thing, is going to have to agree to do
Well,
it
or
the
they could
OJ's
go to
way.
court and fight it. You talk about
I
you
don't
got to
see them
get.
doing that.
No.
And there will be an independent monitor, which is different from the previous agreement that they had.
But when you talk about the rank and file, it doesn't seem like either of the police unions is resisting this a lot because no officer's getting fired because of this. Nobody's in trouble. They're going to get better equipment and training, and they do not seem to be the vocal opponents. That's really coming within City Hall itself.
Right.
Okay, the last story we're going to discuss is one of the happier stories of the year, the return of LeBron James to Cleveland. I haven't picked any of you to choose that. I'm going to lob the ball up in the air and see who wants to take it.
Great.
I think,
Take it away.
I think it's great that LeBron is back. The city's welcomed him back. I think ultimately, we won't be happy unless a championship results from all of this. At least
Oh, we're so greedy.
I know, but
What about the deeper meaning, though? I mean, this city was jubilant when he came back. It was almost like they saw it as an affirmation. It seems like it's about more than basketball, no?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think he's a brand, and having him come back to the city, imbued us with some kind of a credibility and.
I also think though there's a storyline there that we don't often see. We have people leave and they don't come back. I hate to put it that way.
the only thing is, though, is, LeBron, it may turn out that his 4 best years as a pro were those that he spent down there in Miami.
Shame on
Nonetheless, he is exciting to watch. He's got an exciting team around him. They, even in defeat, which is unfortunately all that I've personally seen, they are an exciting team to watch. And, I couldn't help but notice that when Photos, was recommending Cleveland as one of its hot places for 2015, that taking some basketball while you're here was high on their list.
Well, yeah, and you think about it, when the Royals came, the Princess, the Duchess,
Yeah.
Duke and
Yeah.
Duchess of
Yeah.
Canada,
Jersey.
and they went to New York and they saw the Brooklyn Nets play, and who did they meet with afterwards? They met with LeBron, who was with the Cavs visiting, and so yeah, he's obviously he's a global brand.
I mean, he gives us hope, and I guess that never should be underrated.
And what about the thoughts in his letter where he's talking about the disappointment in kids who had looked up to him and he feels their pain? You don't normally see those kind of sentiments from a professional athlete.
I don't know. I think you do. I think I mean, he could have said that before he left. I mean, he's got to take a little hit. He's got to continue to take a bit of a hit for this. I think.
Pete wins the award as the contrarian of 2014. We'll see who does it in 2015. We'll see you next year. We hope you have a happy holiday season.